What would you do if everything you'd built, your home, your memories, your dreams, was suddenly reduced to ashes? For James Fletcher, a widower struggling with loneliness, guilt, and the weight of his past, it seemed like life had closed its final chapter. But just when he thought he had lost it all, an unexpected journey brought him face to face with his greatest fears and a chance for redemption. In this heartwarming story, James discovers the power of family, love, and second chances as he works to rebuild not only his ranch, but also his sense of belonging. Along the way, he uncovers secrets, rekindles hope, and plants the seeds for a legacy that will endure for generations. What surprises does his family have in store? And will James find the strength to embrace the life he thought he had lost? Share your thoughts in the comments below as you follow James's inspiring journey. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories that touch the heart and celebrate the resilience of the human spirit. Now, let's dive into the story. James Fletcher squinted at the sunlight creeping through the blinds of his guest room. It was a room too small to hold all the weight of his memories, but it was where he found himself, day after day, as life moved briskly around him. Outside, Portland streets hummed with life, cars honking, joggers pacing, children laughing, but inside Ethan and Lisa's suburban home, the quiet was stifling. He reached for the photograph on the nightstand, his hands trembling slightly as they always did now. The photo was of Rose, her dark curls framing a face caught mid-laugh. She was seated on the porch of their ranch, her favorite quilt draped across her knees. The sight of her smile, frozen forever in that moment, brought an ache to James's chest. Setting the photo down, James rubbed his eyes and pushed himself upright. His joints creaked in protest, and he winced as he planted his feet on the floor. Another day to get through, he thought grimly. The smell of coffee drifted through the door, and James could hear faint voices in the kitchen, Ethan's low baritone, Lisa's clipped efficiency as she packed their daughter Emma's lunch. James shuffled into the kitchen, the rhythmic squeak of his worn slippers announcing his arrival. "Morning, Dad," Ethan said without looking up from his laptop. His tie was already loosened, and his hair, dark and streaked with gray, looked like he had run his fingers through it one too many times. Lisa glanced over her shoulder from where she stood by the counter. "Good morning, James. Coffee's fresh if you want some." James nodded, pouring himself a cup. The mug was Emma's, a bright pink one decorated with cartoon animals. It felt strange in his hands, too cheerful, but he didn't comment. Emma bounded into the room moments later, her backpack bouncing against her small frame. "Grandpa," she chirped, her face lighting up. "Morning, sweetheart," James replied, forcing a smile. "Can you help me with my puzzle later?" she asked, her brown eyes wide with hope. James hesitated. "Maybe later, Emma. We'll see." Emma's face fell, but Lisa intervened quickly, handing her daughter a juice box. "Go grab your shoes, honey. We're running late." As Emma left, the silence that filled the kitchen was heavy. Ethan closed his laptop with a sigh and reached for his briefcase. "I've got a meeting this afternoon, so I'll probably be late," he said to Lisa. Lisa nodded, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Double shift for me today." "James, would you be able to pick Emma up from school?" "Of course," James said, though the thought of navigating Portland's busy streets filled him with quiet dread. "Thanks, Dad," Ethan said distractedly. "It really helps." James nodded, watching as Ethan and Lisa prepared to leave for the day. As the door closed behind them, the house fell silent again, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator. James sipped his coffee, staring at the empty table. This wasn't home. Not really. Later that afternoon, James gripped the steering wheel tightly as he navigated his way to Emma's school. His knuckles were white, his heart racing every time he had to merge into traffic. The city felt too fast, too unfamiliar, and the noise of honking cars only added to his mounting anxiety. When he finally pulled into the school's pickup lane, his hands were trembling. Emma climbed into the car, her face glowing with excitement. "Guess what we learned in school today, Grandpa?" she exclaimed, launching into a story about a science project involving baking soda and vinegar. James nodded along, his attention split between her words and the GPS directions guiding him back home. The return trip was no less harrowing. and by the time he pulled into the driveway, James's shirt was damp with sweat. "You're the best driver, Grandpa," Emma said, hopping out of the car. James managed a faint smile. "Thanks, sweetheart." Back inside, Emma settled at the dining table with crayons and construction paper. James hovered nearby, unsure of what to do with himself. The house was too quiet, the silence amplifying his unease. Later that evening, as Lisa prepared dinner, James wandered into the hallway and overheard a snippet of conversation between Ethan and Lisa. "It's just a lot," Ethan was saying. "Work's crazy, Emma's always got something going on, and Daddy's so withdrawn. It's like he's not even trying to fit in." James froze. Lisa's reply was softer, almost a murmur. "I don't know," Ethan continued. "Maybe a nursing home would be better. At least he'd have people around, someone to look after him." The rest of the sentence was lost as James backed away, his chest tightening. He felt like a weight had dropped into his stomach. For the next few days, James withdrew further. He declined Emma's invitations to play, skipped meals, and spent most of his time in his room. The guilt gnawed at him. Ethan and Lisa had taken him in, given him a place to stay when he had nowhere else to go, and yet he felt like an intruder in their lives. One sleepless night, he sat at the small desk in his room and began writing a letter. "Dear Ethan, I want to thank you and Lisa for everything you've done for me. I know it hasn't been easy, and I don't want to make things harder for you. It's clear to me that I don't belong here. I've decided it's time for me to leave. Please don't worry about me. I'll find a place where I won't be a burden." James folded the letter carefully and placed it in an envelope, his hands trembling. He sat back, staring at the photograph of Rose on the nightstand. "I'm sorry, Rose," he whispered. "I tried, but I can't do this anymore." The next morning, sunlight streamed through the small gaps in the blinds, bright and intrusive. James turned over in bed, reluctant to face another day. The letter he had written the night before sat on the desk, a silent testament to his thoughts. He stared at it for a long moment before forcing himself up and getting dressed. There was no point in delaying the inevitable. The house was quiet when he emerged from his room. Lisa had already left for work, and Ethan was in his office upstairs, his muffled voice carrying through the ceiling as he answered a phone call. Emma was at school. James poured himself a cup of coffee, the silence in the house almost deafening. He sat at the dining table, his thoughts drifting to the ranch in Montana. He could see it so clearly in his mind, the wide-open fields, the sturdy wooden fence, the big kitchen where Rose used to hum while she cooked. He thought of the barn, where Ethan had learned to saddle a horse, and the garden, where Rose had planted sunflowers along the edges to give the vegetables some company. A part of him had hoped the memories would fade over time, that the ache would dull. But sitting in this suburban house, so far from the life he once knew, only made the absence of those memories more vivid. The fire had taken more than the ranch. It had taken the last tangible pieces of the life he and Rose had built together. Later that day, James decided to step outside and take a walk. The neighborhood was quiet, the lawns neatly trimmed and the sidewalks pristine. It felt foreign, nothing like the rugged, earthy feel of the ranch. As he ambled down the block, his hip began to ache. He stopped to rest on a bench beneath a small maple tree, watching a group of kids ride their bikes up and down the street. One of them reminded him of Ethan at that age, all elbows and knees, his laughter loud and carefree. The thought made James smile faintly, but the moment was short-lived. He rubbed his hip absently, wishing he had brought his cane. The pain was worse than usual today, a reminder of the wear and tear his body had endured over the years. When he returned home, the house was still empty. James sank into the recliner by the window, staring out at the street as dusk began to settle. He stayed there until the front door opened and Ethan walked in, loosening his tie as he stepped inside. "Hey, Dad," Ethan said, pausing when he saw James sitting there. "You been out?" "Just for a walk," James replied. Ethan nodded, heading toward the kitchen. "Lisa's picking up Emma from her friend's house. You hungry? I can throw something together." James shook his head. "I'm fine." Ethan hesitated in the doorway. "Dad," he stopped, shaking his head. "Never mind." James watched him leave, the unspoken words hanging in the air. That night, James couldn't sleep. The mattress felt too soft, the room too small, the air too still. He turned on the lamp and reached for the photo album he kept by the bed. The leather cover was cracked and worn, but the pages inside held the pieces of his old life, preserved like pressed flowers. The first page held a photo of the ranch, taken not long after he and Rose had moved in. The house was modest but strong, its white paint gleaming in the sunlight. Rose had insisted on painting the trim a soft blue, saying it reminded her of the Montana sky. James flipped through the pages slowly, each photo bringing a fresh wave of memories. There was Ethan as a boy, standing beside a calf with a proud grin. Rose in the garden, her hands dirty from planting, but her face lit with joy. The two of them sitting on the porch swing at sunset, the sky ablaze with colors. When he reached the last page, James closed the album and leaned back in his chair, his eyes damp. He thought about the letter still sitting on the desk and wondered if it was the right thing to do. Am I giving up too soon? But the words he had overheard in the kitchen rang in his ears. Maybe a nursing home would be better. The decision felt less like giving up and more like a necessity, a way to make things easier for everyone else. The following evening, over dinner, Ethan finally brought up what had been left unsaid. "Dad," he began, setting down his fork. "We've been talking, Lisa and I, and we want to make sure you're comfortable here." James stiffened, his grip tightening on his own fork. "I'm fine," he said curtly. Ethan exchanged a glance with Lisa. "I just mean if there's anything you need, or if you ever want to talk about other options." "Other options?" James interrupted, his voice sharp. "Like what? A nursing homes?" Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it, clearly caught off guard. "James," Lisa said gently, "no one's saying that. We just want to make sure you're happy." James pushed his chair back and stood. "If you're so worried about me, maybe I should just leave. Wouldn't that solve everything?" "Dad, that's not what we're saying," Ethan began, but James waved him off. "I've had enough for one night," James said, his voice tight. He walked away, leaving Ethan and Lisa sitting at the table in tense silence. In his room, James sat heavily on the edge of the bed, his hands trembling. He felt like a fool for losing his temper, but the frustration and hurt bubbled too close to the surface. He reached for the letter on the desk, staring at it for a long moment before tucking it into the drawer. The days bled into each other, each one marked by the same routines. James avoided lingering at the dinner table, kept his conversations with Ethan and Lisa short, and busied himself with small tasks to occupy his mind. But the letter remained in the drawer, its presence a constant reminder of the choice he had yet to make. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, James stood by the window, watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink. He thought of the ranch, of the sunsets he and Rose had watched together, and felt a pang of longing so sharp it nearly took his breath away. He knew what he had to do. Sitting at the desk, he pulled out the letter and placed it in an envelope. Tomorrow he would give it to Ethan. It was time to go. The next morning, James woke with the clarity of a man who had made peace with a hard decision. He dressed carefully, smoothing out the creases in his shirt and combing his hair with the precision of someone preparing for a formal occasion. The letter was tucked into the breast pocket of his jacket as he shuffled down the hallway. Ethan was in the kitchen, pouring a second cup of coffee while reading something on his tablet. "Morning, Dad," Ethan said without looking up. James hesitated at the edge of the table, his heart pounding. "Ethan, we need to talk." Ethan glanced up, his brows knitting in concern. "Everything okay?" Before James could respond, Lisa entered the kitchen, holding Emma's jacket. "James, there you are. We've been looking for you." James frowned, caught off guard. "Looking for me?" Ethan set down his coffee. "We need you to pack a bag, just for a couple of days." The words hit James like a blow. He stiffened, his hand instinctively moving to the letter in his pocket. Lisa offered a bright smile. "We got something planned. It's a surprise." James's thoughts swirled. Was this how they were doing it? A vague explanation, a promise of a surprise, and then they'd leave him somewhere unfamiliar? "What kind of surprise?" he asked, his voice tighter than he intended. "You'll see," Ethan said, clearly enjoying the mystery. James's mind raced, but he forced himself to nod. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll pack." Back in his room, James pulled his suitcase out from under the bed. He moved methodically, folding shirts and pants with careful precision. The photo of Rose was the last thing he packed, tucking it gently into the side pocket. As he zipped up the suitcase, he paused to look around the room. It had never truly felt like his, just a temporary shelter, but now it seemed to close in on him like a reminder of what he was leaving behind. He opened the desk drawer and retrieved the letter. For a moment, he considered leaving it behind as an explanation, but something inside him resisted. Not yet, he thought. Ethan loaded the suitcase into the trunk as James settled into the back seat of the car. Lisa sat up front, scrolling on her phone, while Ethan drove. Emma wasn't with them, having been dropped off at a friend's house for a sleepover. The drive started in tense silence, the hum of the engine the only sound. James stared out the window, his grip tightening on the armrest every time Ethan merged into a new lane. They left the city behind quickly, the urban sprawl giving way to open fields and winding roads. James found himself momentarily distracted by the familiar scenery, the wildflowers growing along the roadside, the distant silhouettes of mountains against the horizon. The silence became too much to bear. "Where are we going?" James asked, his voice sharp. "You'll see," Ethan said, a faint smile playing on his lips. James's chest tightened. The ambiguity felt deliberate, almost cruel. Lisa turned in her seat, her tone light. "You're gonna love it. Trust us." James forced a nod, but felt anything but reassured. The car turned onto a gravel road, the crunch of stones under the tires jarring against the stillness of the countryside. James's palms were clammy, his heart racing as they approached a clearing. When the car came to a stop, Ethan got out first, opening the back door for James. "Come on, Dad. We're here." James hesitated, his grip tightening on the suitcase. His eyes scanned the horizon, expecting the impersonal facade of a nursing home or some similar institution. Instead, he saw a house. Not just any house's house. James froze, his breath catching in his throat. The white paint was peeling, the porch sagging slightly, and the windows were dusty, but it was unmistakably the ranch he had left behind years ago. His legs felt weak, and Ethan quickly moved to steady him. "Easy, Dad," Ethan said gently. James shook his head, disbelief and confusion warring in his mind. Why are we here?" Lisa stepped forward, her smile warm. "We thought it was time you saw it again." James's chest tightened as he stared at the house. The last time he had seen it, it had been a charred skeleton, the fire reducing everything inside to ash. Now, even in its worn state, it stood resilient against the backdrop of open fields. "Come inside," Ethan said. "There's something we want to show you." The interior of the house was dim, the air carrying a faint, musty smell of neglect. Dust motes floated in the sunlight, streaming through the cracked windows. James hesitated in the doorway, his gaze sweeping over the empty living room. The marks on the floor where the rocking chair once sat were still visible. The corner where the Christmas tree had always gone, now bare, seemed to whisper of the laughter and warmth that had once filled the space. Ethan moved ahead, flipping on a flashlight. It's been sitting empty since the fire, but it's still solid. The foundation, the walls, they're strong. Lisa joined James, her voice soft. "We've been working on it little by little. We thought maybe you'd want to help." James turned to her, his brow furrowed. "Help? What do you mean?" "We're rebuilding it," Ethan said, stepping back into the living room. "We want to bring it back. For you. For all of us." James felt like the floor had been pulled out from under him. He shook his head, his voice trembling. "Why? Why go through all this trouble?" "Because this isn't just a house," Ethan said firmly. "It's part of who we are, and it's part of you." James's gaze fell to the floor. The memories were too much: the fire, the loss, the years of silence that followed. "I don't know if I can do this," he whispered. "You don't have to do it alone," Ethan replied. The stillness inside the house felt heavy, almost suffocating. James's footsteps echoed faintly as he walked through the empty rooms. Each one carried a memory, a piece of the life he had built with Rose. The kitchen, where Rose used to hum old country songs as she cooked, now stood bare. The counter where Ethan had once sat doing homework was chipped and worn. The living room, with its faded walls, still bore faint scorch marks near the baseboards, a haunting reminder of the fire that had taken so much. James paused in the doorway of what had once been Ethan's bedroom. The walls were marked with faded pencil lines where Rose had measured Ethan's height every year on his birthday. She never wanted to paint over it, James murmured, his voice barely audible. Ethan stepped up beside him, his expression soft. I remember. She used to say it was our family's timeline. James nodded, swallowing hard. It feels like stepping into a graveyard, he admitted. Ethan placed a hand on his shoulder. It doesn't have to. It can be a fresh start. James turned to him, his eyes brimming with doubt. What if I'm not ready for a fresh start? Ethan didn't answer right away. You don't have to be ready all at once, Dad. Just take one step at a time. The following day, Ethan and Lisa invited James to join them as they began clearing out the attic. James hesitated, reluctant to face what he might find, but eventually agreed. The attic was dim and dusty, filled with old boxes, broken furniture, and forgotten belongings. The scent of aged wood and mildew hung in the air. Lisa opened a box and pulled out a stack of faded books. Rose's cookbooks, she said with a smile. James took them, his hands trembling slightly as he flipped through the pages. The recipes were peppered with Rose's handwritten notes, little comments like add more sugar for James or Ethan's favorite double the frosting. She always made sure we had what we needed, James said softly, a bittersweet smile tugging at his lips. Ethan rummaged through another box and pulled out a rusted horseshoe. Remember this, Dad? James took the horseshoe, his grip tightening as memories flooded back. Paladin's shoe, he said. I thought we lost this in the fire. It was buried under some debris in the barn, Ethan said. We saved what we could. Lisa suddenly gasped, holding up a small, charred frame. Look at this. It was a family photo taken years ago, James, Rose, and a young Ethan standing in front of the barn. The edges of the photo were singed, but their faces were intact, smiling brightly despite the wear and tear. James's throat tightened as he took the frame. I thought this was gone, he whispered. It's not much, Ethan said, but it's something to start with. James nodded, holding the frame close. For the first time, the idea of rebuilding didn't feel entirely impossible. That evening, James sat on the porch, staring out at the open fields. The stars were beginning to appear, their faint light casting a quiet serenity over the landscape. Ethan joined him, handed him a cup of tea. You've been quiet today, Ethan said. James sighed. It's a lot to take in, being back here. Ethan nodded. I get it. This place holds a lot of memories for all of us. It's not just the memories, James said. It's the weight of everything I lost. Coming back feels like tearing open a wound that never fully healed. Ethan didn't respond right away. Instead, he sipped his tea, letting the silence linger before speaking. Do you remember the summer I learned to ride Paladin? James frowned. Of course. You fell off so many times. I thought you'd give up for good. Ethan chuckled. But I didn't. Because you didn't let me. You told me falling wasn't the end. It was just part of learning. James stared into his cup, his son's words sinking in. I know this is hard, Dad, Ethan continued. But rebuilding isn't about forgetting what we lost. It's about honoring it. James felt a lump rise in his throat. He looked at Ethan, the sincerity in his son's eyes undeniable. You sound just like your mother, he said quietly. I'll take that as a compliment, Ethan replied with a small smile. The next morning, James woke early. The house was still quiet, the sunlight casting long shadows through the windows. He dressed slowly, his joints stiff, and made his way outside. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of wildflowers from the nearby fields. Ethan was already in the barn, sorting through a pile of old tools. He looked up as James approached, a hint of surprise on his face. Morning, Dad, Ethan said. You're up early. James nodded, his gaze sweeping over the barn. Thought I'd see if you needed an extra pair of hands. Ethan smiled. Always. Together, they worked in the barn, clearing out broken boards and salvaging what they could. It was slow, painstaking work, but for the first time in a long while, James felt a sense of purpose. As they took a break, Ethan handed James a water bottle. You know, Ethan said, "Mom always said this barn was your favorite place on the ranch." James chuckled. She wasn't wrong. It was the heart of the place. Everything started here. Ethan nodded. Then it seems like the right place to start again. James looked at his son, a small but genuine smile crossing his face. "Maybe it is," he said softly. The first real workday on the ranch dawned crisp and golden, the sun casting a warm glow over the fields. James stood by the garden, watching as Ethan unloaded a stack of fresh lumber from the back of a truck. Lisa was already in the house, sweeping out years of dust, while Emma played near the barn with a basket of wildflowers. "Ready to get started?" Ethan called, his voice breaking through James's thoughts. James nodded, adjusting his gloves. "What's the plan?" "Start with the garden fence," Ethan said, handing him a hammer. "It's been leaning for years. Figured we'd rebuild it from scratch." James followed him to the edge of the garden, the memory of Rose planting sunflowers there tugging at his chest. He set the hammer down for a moment, tracing the outline of the fence posts with his gaze. "She loved this spot," James said quietly. Ethan paused, leaning on his own post-hole digger. "Yes, she did. She used to say it was the happiest corner of the ranch." For the next few hours, they worked side by side, pulling out the rotted posts and digging fresh holes. The rhythmic swing of the hammer felt oddly soothing, each strike a small but tangible sign of progress. By noon, James's arms ached, but there was a satisfaction in seeing the first section of the new fence standing tall. Lisa appeared with sandwiches and iced tea, her face bright despite the dust on her clothes. "Thought you two could use a break." James sank onto an overturned bucket, grateful for the rest. He sipped his tea slowly, watching as Emma ran up to the newly erected fence. "It looks strong, Grandpa," she said, running her fingers over the smooth wood. James smiled faintly. "It is, sweetheart." That evening, after dinner, Lisa approached James with a small box in her hands. "I found this in the attic," she said, setting it on the table. James opened the box slowly, his breath catching when he saw the contents. A bundle of letters tied with twine, the edges singed but intact. "They're from Rose," Lisa said softly. "I thought you might want to read them." James's hands trembled as he untied the twine. The first letter he opened was addressed to him. "Dear James, today, I spent the morning in the garden planting sunflowers. You always tease me about them, saying they take up too much space, but I can't help it. They remind me of us rooted together, always turning toward the light." The words blurred as tears filled James's eyes. He set the letter down and pressed his hands to his face. Ethan, who had been watching quietly from the doorway, stepped forward. "Mom had a way of seeing the beauty in everything," he said. James nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "She saw beauty in me when I didn't deserve it." "You did, Dad," Ethan said firmly. "And you still do." James looked at his son, the weight of his guilt and grief slowly giving way to something lighter of fragile but growing hope. The next day, James woke early, a renewed sense of purpose driving him out of bed. He dressed quickly and headed to the garden, where Ethan was already working on the fence. "What's on the agenda today?" James asked, picking up a shovel. "Planting," Ethan replied. "I thought we'd start with some tomatoes and peppers. Emma wants to add sunflowers along the edge, like Mom used to do." James nodded, the memory bringing a bittersweet smile to his face. She liked that. Together, they worked the soil, the rhythm of digging and planting soothing in its simplicity. James found himself talking more than he had in weeks, sharing stories about the ranch in its early days, how he and Rose had built the barn by hand, the mishaps they'd had with stubborn cattle, and the quiet evenings spent watching the stars from the porch. Ethan listened intently, asking questions and laughing at his father's dry humor. By the time the last row was planted, the garden looked vibrant and full of promise. Emma skipped over, carrying a packet of sunflower seeds. "Grandpa, can I plant these?" she asked. James knelt beside her, guiding her hands as she pressed the seeds into the soil. "These are special," he said. "They're for your grandma." Emma's face lit up. "Will they grow big?" James nodded. "As big as the sun." That evening, the family gathered on the porch, watching the sun set over the newly planted garden. The sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, the kind of colors Rose had always loved. Lisa leaned against Ethan, her hand resting on his knee. Emma sat at James's feet, her head resting on his leg as she dozed off. "It's starting to feel like home again," Ethan said softly. James looked at his son, then at the house, the barn, and the garden. For the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of something he thought he had lost forever: belonging. "Your mom would be proud," James said. "She'd be proud of you, too," Ethan replied. James didn't respond right away, letting the words settle over him. The ache of loss was still there, but it was no longer unbearable. It was a part of him, just like the ranch, just like his family. "We've got a lot more to do," James said after a long pause. Ethan smiled. "One step at a time." James nodded, the corners of his mouth lifting into a small but genuine smile. One step at a time. The following morning, James stood at the edge of the field, the dewy grass brushing against his boots. The ranch stretched out before him, its openness both comforting and daunting. It had been years since he'd felt the weight of this view, the horizon seemingly endless, the air carrying the faint scent of wildflowers and freshly turned soil. Ethan approached from the barn, carrying a pair of weathered shovels over his shoulder. "Ready to get back to it?" he asked, a grin tugging at his lips. James nodded, though his muscles still ached from the previous day's work. "What's on the docket today?" "Clearing the old drainage ditch," Ethan said, handing James one of the shovels. "If we don't, the lower field will flood when it rains." James smirked. "You sound just like me 30 years ago." Ethan laughed. "I learned from the best." They worked side by side, the rhythmic scrape of shovels breaking the quiet. The ditch had filled with years of debris, fallen branches, clumps of weeds, and layers of packed mud. "You remember the time this thing overflowed?" Ethan asked, wiping sweat from his brow. James chuckled, pausing to lean on his shovel. "Your mom was so mad. Said it ruined her flower beds. I spent a week hauling those poor drowned plants out of the garden." "And you swore you'd fix the ditch," Ethan added. "Guess it's time I made good on that promise," James said with a wry grin. By the time they finished, the ditch was clear, the water flowing freely again. James stood back, his breathing heavy but even, and surveyed their work. "Not bad for a couple of amateurs," he said. Ethan clapped him on the shoulder. "Not bad at all." That afternoon, as James rested on the porch, a familiar truck pulled into the driveway. The engine rumbled to a stop, and Tom Garrett stepped out, his weathered face breaking into a wide grin. "Tom," James called, squinting against the sunlight. "The one and only," Tom replied, climbing the steps two at a time. "Heard you were back. Thought I'd drop by and see it for myself." James stood, meeting his old friend halfway. They clasped hands tightly before pulling each other into a brief, backslapping hug. "It's been too long," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "Damn right it has," Tom said. "Last time I saw you, this place was nothing but ash and rubble. Thought you'd given up on it." "So did I," James admitted. Tom glanced around, taking in the repaired barn, the fresh garden fence, and the vibrant patches of wildflowers Emma had planted along the driveway. "Looks like you've got yourself a second chance." James nodded, his gaze following Tom's. "I owe that to Ethan. He wouldn't let me walk away." "Well, you've got a good one there," Tom said, leaning against the porch railing. "But don't sell yourself short. You've still got plenty of fight left in you, James." James smiled faintly, the words settling over him like a bomb. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, James found himself standing at the edge of the garden, a small sapling cradled in his arms. Its roots were wrapped carefully in burlap, its young branches swaying gently in the breeze. Ethan and Lisa approached, curiosity etched on their faces. "What's that?" Ethan asked. "An apple tree," James said simply. Lisa smiled. "Rose always wanted one, didn't she?" James nodded, his voice quiet. "She talked about it for years. Said she wanted to plant it right here, where the garden meets the fields. Said it would be a symbol of something lasting." Ethan stepped forward. "Let's plant it." James hesitated. "You sure? I mean, it's just a tree." "It's more than that," Ethan interrupted. Together, they dug a hole at the edge of the garden, the soil rich and dark. James placed the sapling carefully into the ground, his hands trembling slightly as he packed the earth around its roots. As they stepped back, Emma came running up, a watering can sloshing in her hands. "Can I help?" James smiled, his heart swelling. "Of course." Emma tipped the watering can over the base of the tree, her face glowing with pride. "What kind of apples will it grow?" she asked. "The best kind," James said, his voice warm. The family gathered on the porch that night, the sky above them a blanket of stars. The apple tree stood silhouetted against the horizon, its young branches reaching upward. Lisa brought out a pitcher of lemonade, pouring glasses for everyone. Emma sat cross-legged on the porch swing, her eyes heavy with sleep, but her smile unwavering. James leaned back in his chair, the cool evening air brushing against his face. He felt a profound stillness settle over him, a sense of belonging he hadn't felt in years. "You did good today, Dad," Ethan said, breaking the silence. James looked at his son, his throat tightening. "We all did." Ethan nodded, his gaze drifting to the apple tree. "Mom would love this." James followed his gaze, his chest swelling with a mixture of pride and longing. "She would," he said softly. As the conversation ebbed and flowed around him, James let his thoughts wander. The ranch was far from finished. There were still repairs to make, fields to tend, and fences to rebuild, but for the first time, he felt like he was part of something again. He glanced at Ethan, then at Emma, her small hands clutching her glass of lemonade, and felt a quiet certainty settle over him. "I think we're going to be okay," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. The morning was bright and cool as James stepped onto the porch, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. He had risen early, as he often did these days, eager to make the most of the sunlight. The ranch was quieter than it used to be, but the land felt alive again, a stark contrast to the hushed emptiness he had grown used to. The sound of gravel crunching under tires broke the morning stillness. James squinted against the rising sun, watching as a truck pulled into the driveway. The vehicle was old but well kept, and James recognized it instantly. "Tom," James murmured, setting his coffee on the railing. Tom Garrett climbed out of the truck with a grin, his faded cap perched lopsided on his head. "You didn't think I'd let you do this all alone, did you?" Tom called, his voice carrying across the yard. Before James could respond, two more trucks pulled in behind Tom's, each loaded with tools, lumber, and eager faces. Ethan stepped out of the barn, his eyes widening as he took in the scene. "What's all this?" "Reinforcements," Tom said with a wink. "Word got out you were fixing the place up. Figured we'd lend a hand." James felt a lump rise in his throat as he watched old neighbors and friends climb out of the trucks, waving and smiling. The ranch buzzed with activity as the group divided into teams. Tom and Ethan led the effort to repair the barn roof, while Lisa and a few others tackled the task of cleaning and painting the house. James found himself working alongside Mrs. Wilson, an elderly neighbor who had been one of Rose's closest friends. "You know," Mrs. Wilson said as she scrubbed the porch railing, "Rose always believed this place would bring people together." James paused, wiping sweat from his brow. "She did." Mrs. Wilson nodded. "She used to say the ranch wasn't just a home, it was a haven, a place where people could feel like they belonged." James's chest tightened at the memory. Rose had always seen the ranch as more than a property. It had been her dream, her sanctuary, and her gift to their family. "I'm starting to see what she meant," James said quietly. By the time the sun began to set, the ranch was transformed. The barn stood tall and sturdy, its roof gleaming with fresh shingles. The house sparkled with a new coat of paint, and the garden fence was completely rebuilt. As everyone gathered on the porch for a potluck dinner, James stood back, taking it all in. "You've got good people here," Tom said, clapping him on the back. James nodded, his throat tight. "I didn't think anyone would care about this place anymore." "They care because you cared," Tom said simply. That night, after the neighbors had gone home, James sat on the porch, staring out at the moonlit fields. The ranch was quiet again, but it no longer felt lonely. Ethan joined him, handing him a glass of iced tea. "You okay, Dad?" James nodded. "Just thinking." Ethan sat beside him, waiting. Today was something James said finally. Seeing everyone come together like that. Ethan smiled. Mom would have loved it. James looked down at his hands, the lines and calluses etched deep. She always believed in this place, even when I doubted it. She believed in you, Ethan said gently. And so do I. James swallowed hard, the weight of Ethan's words settling over him. I'm proud of you, Ethan, James said after a long pause. I don't say it enough, but I am. Ethan's smile widened. Thanks, Dad. That means a lot. They sat in silence for a while, the air between them warm and full of unspoken understanding. The grand reopening of the ranch dawned bright and clear. Ethan had invited neighbors, friends, and even some family members who hadn't visited in years. James stood on the porch, watching as cars pulled into the driveway. Tom arrived early, helping to set up tables and chairs in the yard. Lisa decorated the tables with jars of wildflowers, while Emma bounced excitedly from one task to another. By noon, the yard was filled with people. There was laughter and chatter, the smell of barbecue wafting through the air, and the sound of children playing near the garden. Ethan stepped onto the porch, tapping a glass to get everyone's attention. Thank you all for coming, he began, his voice carrying across the crowd. This ranch isn't just a piece of land. It's a part of our family's story, and it wouldn't be standing here today without my dad. Ethan turned to James, his eyes bright with emotion. He's the heart of this place, the reason we're all here, and I couldn't be prouder to call him my father. The crowd erupted into applause, and James felt his face flush. Ethan handed him the glass, gesturing for him to speak. James cleared his throat, his hands trembling slightly. I don't have the words to tell you all how much this means to me, he began. For a long time, I thought this place was gone forever. I thought I had lost everything. He paused, looking out at the crowd. But seeing all of you here today, I realize I was wrong. This ranch isn't just wood and nails. It's memories, love, and hope. And I'm grateful more than I can say to have it back. The applause was deafening, and James felt tears welling in his eyes. As the celebration wound down and the guests began to leave, James found himself back on the porch, watching the stars appear one by one. Ethan joined him, handing him a mug of coffee. You did good today, Dad, Ethan said. James chuckled. We all did. He looked out at the garden, where the newly planted apple tree stood silhouetted against the horizon. The sight filled him with a quiet pride, a sense of belonging he hadn't felt in years. This place feels alive again, James said. It is, Ethan replied. James nodded, a small but genuine smile crossing his face. Thanks to you. Ethan shook his head. Thanks to us. The morning after the celebration, the ranch was quiet again. James sat on the porch, sipping his coffee as the first rays of sunlight kissed the fields. The air smelled of damp earth and wildflowers, a reminder of the work that still lay ahead. He glanced at the garden, where the apple tree stood, its young branches swaying gently in the breeze. It wasn't much, yet just a sapling, but it held promise. For years, James had avoided thinking about the ranch, about the fire, about Rose. The memories had felt too sharp, too raw. But now, as he sat in the stillness of the early morning, those memories felt like an anchor rather than a weight. The sound of footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. Ethan appeared, 2 steaming mugs in his hands. Figured you could use a refill, Ethan said, handing one to James. James took the mug with a nod. Thanks, son. Ethan sat beside him, the wooden steps creaking under their combined weight. You okay? James sipped his coffee, his gaze fixed on the horizon. I'm getting there, he said after a long pause. Yesterday was something. Ethan chuckled. It was a good day. James nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Yeah, it was. By mid-morning, the ranch was alive with activity once again. Ethan had made a detailed list of tasks that needed attention, and he, James, and Lisa divided the workload. James took charge of the garden, determined to see it flourish. He spent hours weeding, watering, and tending to the rows of vegetables and flowers. Emma joined him, her small hands eager to help. Grandpa, look, she said, holding up a tiny green sprout. It's growing. James crouched beside her, his knees protesting the movement. That's a cucumber, he said with a smile. Do you think it'll taste good? If we take care of it, it'll taste great, James said, patting her on the shoulder. The hours passed quickly, the repetitive tasks bringing a sense of calm and purpose. By the time the sun began to dip low in the sky, James felt a tiredness that was more satisfying than draining. As he straightened up, his gaze drifted to the apple tree. He walked over to it, running his fingers along the bark. "We're going to make this work," he said softly, as if speaking to Rose. That evening, Lisa prepared a hearty dinner: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and freshly baked bread. The family gathered around the dining table, the warm glow of the overhead light making the room feel cozy and alive. Emma chattered excitedly about the sprouts in the garden, her enthusiasm infectious. "You should have seen Grandpa," she said, grinning. "He knew all the plants." James chuckled. "It's not magic, kiddo. Just years of practice." Ethan raised his glass. "To Dad," he said, "for teaching us everything we know." Lisa smiled, lifting her glass as well. "And to new beginnings." James hesitated, his chest tight with emotion, before lifting his own glass. "To family," he said simply. The clinking of glasses filled the room, followed by laughter and the soft hum of conversation. After dinner, Ethan suggested clearing out the last of the attic. James hesitated but eventually agreed, curious about what else might have been tucked away over the years. They climbed the narrow stairs, the air growing cooler as they reached the attic. Dust floated in the beam of Ethan's flashlight, and the faint scent of mothballs lingered in the air. "Let's start with that corner," Ethan said, pointing to a stack of old trunks. James opened the first trunk cautiously. Inside were blankets, photo albums, and a small wooden box. He picked up the box, running his fingers over the carved lid. "What's that?" Ethan asked, setting down an armful of books. James opened the box, revealing a set of small, neatly labeled jars. Each one contained seeds: corn, tomatoes, wildflowers, and more. "Your mom's seed collection," James said, his voice thick. "She kept these for years. Always said she'd plant them when the time was right." Ethan leaned closer, examining the jars. "Maybe it's time now." James looked at his son, his chest swelling with a mix of sadness and hope. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Maybe it is." The next morning, James and Ethan brought the seed jars to the garden. Lisa and Emma joined them, each taking a section to plant. James carefully opened one of the jars, the label reading Rose's sunflowers in delicate handwriting. "She loved these," James said, his voice soft. Emma knelt beside him, holding a trowel. "Can I help, Grandpa?" James smiled, his heart full. "Of course, sweetheart." Together, they planted the sunflower seeds along the edge of the garden. As they worked, James felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. When they finished, James stood back surveying the garden. The rows of freshly planted seeds, the sturdy fence, and the young apple tree all seemed to shimmer with life. "Looks good," Ethan said, wiping dirt from his hands. James nodded, a genuine smile breaking across his face. "It does." Weeks passed, and the ranch began to flourish. The garden thrived, the barn stood sturdy and repaired, and the once empty house was filled with laughter and warmth. James found himself waking earlier each day, eager to start the morning's work. Emma had taken to checking the garden daily, her excitement growing with every new sprout. "Grandpa, the sunflowers are getting taller," she called one morning, waving him over. James walked over, his cane steadying him as he knelt beside her. The sunflowers were indeed thriving, their leaves lush and vibrant. "You've got a good eye, kiddo," James said, ruffling her hair. "They're going to be so big," Emma said, her face glowing. James chuckled, feeling a swell of pride. For the first time in years, the ranch felt alive again, its spirit rekindled by the work of their hands and hearts. One afternoon, while repairing a section of fencing near the lower field, James decided to push himself a little harder. The ground was uneven, and the heat of the day bore down on him, but he wanted to finish before the evening. "Dad, you sure you don't want to take a break?" Ethan asked, concern etched on his face. "I'm fine," James said curtly, waving him off. But as he hoisted a heavy plank into place, his foot caught on a patch of loose dirt. He stumbled, the plank slipping from his grasp, and landed hard on the ground. Pain shot through his hip and lower back, leaving him breathless. Ethan was at his side in seconds. "Dad, are you okay?" James gritted his teeth, trying to sit up. "I'm fine," he muttered, though his body protested every movement. "You're not fine," Ethan said firmly, helping him to his feet. "Come on, let's get you inside." James resisted at first, but eventually relented, leaning heavily on Ethan as they made their way back to the house. That evening, James sat in his room, his pride bruised more than his body. The fall had shaken him, not just physically, but emotionally. He had been so focused on proving his worth, on showing that he could still contribute, and now he felt like he had failed. The letter he had written months ago, the one he thought he'd never need again, came back to his mind. Maybe Ethan was right, he thought bitterly. Maybe I don't belong here anymore. His thoughts spiraled as he replayed the events of the day, each moment reinforcing the belief that he was more of a burden than a help. The next morning, Ethan found James sitting on the porch, staring at the sunrise. "Morning, Dad," Ethan said cautiously, taking a seat beside him. James didn't respond right away, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Finally, he said, "I've been thinking maybe it's time for me to step back." Ethan frowned. "What do you mean?" James hesitated, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. "This place is your future, not mine. I don't want to hold you back." Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Dad, this place wouldn't exist without you. Everything I know, everything I care about, it comes from you. You're not holding me back. You're the reason I'm here." James shook his head, emotion tightening his throat. "I just don't want to be a burden, Ethan." Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "You wrote this, didn't you?" James's heart sank as he recognized the farewell letter he had written months ago. "I found it in your room after you left for the ranch," Ethan said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Dad, we never wanted you to leave. We wanted you to come home." James stared at the letter, his hands trembling. "Don't you get it?" Ethan continued. "This ranch isn't just a place. It's our family, and you're the heart of it." James couldn't hold back the tears that spilled over. He nodded slowly, his voice breaking as he said, "I'm sorry, son. I let my doubts get the better of me." Ethan placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "We all have doubts, Dad, but we're in this together. Always." That afternoon, James joined Ethan and Lisa in the garden, determined to push past his doubts. Together, they worked to plant a new row of vegetables, their hands moving in quiet harmony. As they worked, Emma ran up, holding a small wildflower she had picked near the barn. "Grandpa, this is for you," she said, holding it out to him. James took the flower, his heart swelling. "Thank you, sweetheart." As he tucked the flower into the pocket of his shirt, he looked around the ranch. The barn stood strong, the garden was thriving, and the laughter of his family filled the air. For the first time in a long time, James felt truly at peace. The next day, James sat under the shade of the old oak tree near the garden. The wildflower Emma had given him still tucked into his shirt pocket. He watched as Lisa and Emma worked in the garden, their laughter carrying on the breeze. Ethan approached, carrying a small toolbox. "Thought you might like to help me fix the porch steps," he said. James raised an eyebrow. "You sure you trust me after yesterday?" Ethan smirked. "I trust you more than I trust myself with a hammer." With a groan, James pushed himself to his feet. "All right, let's see what kind of mess we can make." The two of them spent the next hour replacing the worn steps on the porch. James's movements were slower than they used to be, but the rhythm of the work felt familiar and grounding. "Do you remember the time you fell through the porch?" James asked, a sly grin on his face. Ethan laughed. "How could I forget? You told me not to jump on the loose boards, and I did it anyway." "You had a splinter the size of a toothpick in your hand," James said, shaking his head. "Your mom nearly had a heart attack." Ethan chuckled, his expression softening. "You patched it up in a day. Mom said you were like magic with wood and nails." James paused, his grip tightening on the hammer. "She always believed in me, even when I didn't deserve it." "You always deserved it, Dad," Ethan said, meeting his gaze. "And you still do." That evening, James sat alone on the porch, the wildflower now resting in a small jar of water on the table beside him. The stars glittered overhead, their light mirrored in the quiet stillness of the ranch. He thought about the work they had done that day, the laughter they had shared, and the memories that had surfaced. But beneath the warmth of those moments lingered a familiar shadow doubt. The fall had shaken him more deeply than he had admitted, and the letter Ethan had found still lingered in his mind. What if they're just humoring me? He thought. What if they're too kind to tell me the truth? The creak of the screen door pulled him from his thoughts. Lisa stepped out, a blanket draped over her arm. "Thought you might need this," she said, handing him the blanket. "Thanks," James said, pulling it over his lap. Lisa hesitated, then sat beside him. "You've been quiet tonight," she said gently. James let out a long breath. "Just thinking." "About?" James glanced at her, his brow furrowed. "About whether I'm really helping here, or if I'm just in the way." Lisa's expression softened. "James, you're not in the way. This ranch is as much yours as it is Ethan's, or mine, or Emma's. You belong here." James looked down at his hands, the calluses on his palms a testament to years of hard work. "Sometimes, I'm not sure I believe that." Lisa reached over, placing a hand on his arm. "Ethan might not say it enough, but he looks up to you. He always has. And Emma? She adores you. She talks about you all the time, how much fun she is helping you in the garden, how much she learns from you." James swallowed hard, emotion tightening his throat. "I don't want to let them down." "You won't," Lisa said firmly. "You never have." The next morning, James woke early, the conversation with Lisa still echoing in his mind. He dressed quickly and headed outside, determined to face the day with a renewed sense of purpose. Ethan was already in the barn, sorting through a pile of tools. "Morning, Dad," he said, glancing up. "Morning," James replied. "What's on the agenda today?" Ethan grinned. "The chicken coop needs some repairs. Think you're up for it?" James smirked. "I've been fixing chicken coops since before you could walk. Let's get to it." The two of them worked side by side, replacing broken boards and reinforcing the structure. The chickens clucked noisily in the background, occasionally pecking at the scattered seeds Emma had thrown for them earlier. By the time they finished, the coop looked as sturdy as it had in its prime. Ethan stepped back, admiring their work. "Looks good." James nodded, a small but genuine smile crossing his face. "It does." "Thanks, Dad," Ethan said, his voice soft. "For everything." James looked at his son, his chest swelling with pride and gratitude. "I'm proud of you, Ethan. Always have been." That evening, James sat at the small desk in his room, a fresh sheet of paper in front of him. The farewell letter he had written months ago was long gone, but the act of writing felt necessary, like closing a chapter he no longer needed. He picked up the pen, his hand steady as he began to write. "Dear Ethan, Lisa, and Emma, I want you to know how much this ranch and all of you mean to me. For a long time, I thought I had lost everything, but you've shown me that love, family, and purpose aren't tied to what we lose, they're built on what we share. Thank you for reminding me of that." When he finished, James folded the letter and placed it in the drawer. It wasn't a goodbye this time, it was a promise to himself to keep moving forward. The next day, James gathered the family near the apple tree. Emma carried a small bag of seeds, her face glowing with excitement. "What are we planting today, Grandpa?" she asked. "Wildflowers," James said, holding up the bag. "They'll grow all around the tree, just like your grandma would have wanted." Together, they scattered the seeds, their hands working in harmony. James guided Emma as she dug small holes, explaining how the seeds would sprout and grow. As they finished, James stood back, his gaze sweeping over the garden, the tree, and the ranch beyond. "This place is starting to feel like home again," he said softly. "It always has been," Ethan replied. James nodded, a deep sense of peace settling over him. For the first time in years, he felt truly rooted not just in the land, but in the love of his family. The sun rose early over the ranch, casting long shadows across the fields. James stood at the edge of the garden, watching as Ethan and Lisa carried baskets to the newly thriving vegetable beds. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the faint scent of wildflowers that had begun to bloom near the apple tree. Ready to see the fruits of your labor, Grandpa? Emma asked, bouncing excitedly beside him. James chuckled. Let's hope the rabbits haven't eaten it all. The family worked together, picking ripe tomatoes, peppers, and cucumbers. Emma darted from one row to the next, her basket quickly filling with vibrant vegetables. Grandpa, look, she called, holding up a particularly large cucumber. James smiled, his heart swelling with pride. That's a good one, kiddo. Your grandma would have been impressed. As they finished, James looked around the garden, the sense of accomplishment settling over him like a warm blanket. The ranch was alive again, not just in its physical form, but in the spirit of the people who had poured their love and effort into it. That afternoon, the ranch buzzed with activity as old friends and neighbors returned for another gathering. This time, it was a celebration of the first harvest, a symbolic milestone in the ranch's restoration. James stood near the barn, watching as guests arrived, their faces lighting up at the sight of the thriving garden and repaired buildings. Tom approached, clapping James on the back. You've outdone yourself, old man. James smirked. It wasn't just me. It took a village and then some. Tom nodded, his grin softening. Rose will be proud, you know, of you, of this place, of all of it. James swallowed hard, the emotion tightening his chest. I hope so. As the day unfolded, laughter and conversation filled the air. Children ran through the fields, couples admired the garden, and neighbors shared stories of the ranch's past. Ethan stepped onto the porch, raising a glass to get everyone's attention. Thank you all for being here, he began, his voice strong but warm. This ranch has always been more than a home. It's been a place of connection, of growth, and of love. And none of that would be possible without my dad. The crowd erupted into applause as Ethan turned to James. Dad, you've shown us what it means to work hard, to care deeply, and to believe in something bigger than ourselves. We're proud to call this place ours, but even prouder to call you our family. James felt a lump rise in his throat as Ethan gestured for him to speak. He stepped forward, clearing his throat. I don't have the words to say how much this means to me, he began, his voice trembling. For a long time, I thought I had lost everything. But you all reminded me that what matters most isn't what we lose, it's what we build together. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. This ranch isn't just my past. It's our future, and I'm grateful to share it with all of you. The applause was deafening, and James felt tears prick at his eyes as he stepped back, his heart full. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, James found himself standing near the apple tree. The wildflowers they had planted around its base were beginning to bloom, their colors vibrant against the soft light. Ethan joined him, a shovel in hand. Got a minute? James raised an eyebrow. What's that for? Ethan grinned. I thought we could plant another tree. For the next generation. James's chest tightened as he took the shovel. Together, they dug a small hole beside the apple tree, the soil rich and dark. Ethan handed James a young sapling, its roots carefully wrapped in burlap. James placed the tree gently into the ground, his hands steady as he packed the soil around its base. What kind of tree is it? He asked. Peach, Ethan said. Emma's favorite. James chuckled, his heart swelling with pride. She'll love it. As they finished, Emma ran up, her eyes wide with excitement. Is it for me, Grandpa? James nodded. It's for all of us, kiddo. A promise of sweet tomorrows. Emma beamed, throwing her arms around James in a tight hug. Later that evening, after the guests had left and the ranch had grown quiet, James sat on the porch with Ethan, Lisa, and Emma. The stars twinkled above, their light mirrored in the gleaming windows of the house. Feels good, doesn't it? Ethan said, breaking the comfortable silence. James nodded. It does. Better than I ever thought it could. Lisa leaned back in her chair, a content smile on her face. This place has a way of healing, doesn't it? It's not just the place, James said. It's the people. All of you. Emma climbed onto James's lap, her head resting against his chest. Grandpa, can we plant more trees tomorrow? James chuckled, his arms wrapping around her. As many as you want, sweetheart. The family sat together, the warmth of their connection filling the quiet night. For the first time in years, James felt truly at peace, not just with the ranch, but with himself. The next morning, James stood by the garden, watching as the first rays of sunlight touched the apple tree. The wildflowers swayed gently in the breeze, their colors vibrant and full of life. Ethan joined him, his hands in his pockets. "What are you thinking about, Dad?" James smiled, his gaze never leaving the tree. "I'm thinking about how far we've come, and how much further we can go." Ethan nodded. "We got a good thing here." "We do," James said softly. As they stood in silence, the ranch seemed to hum with quiet energy, a living testament to the love and resilience that had brought it back to life. James turned to Ethan, a spark of determination in his eyes. "Let's keep it going. 4 rows. For all of us." Ethan smiled. "Always." As James stood by the garden, watching the sunlight touch the apple tree and the wildflowers blooming beneath it, he felt a peace he hadn't known in years. The ranch was more than a place now, it was a promise of new beginnings, built with love, resilience, and the family that surrounded him. If stories like James's journey inspire you to reflect on the power of family, hope, and perseverance, we'd love to have you join our community. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more heartfelt stories that celebrate the moments and connections that matter most. Tap the notification bell so you never miss an update, and as always, thank you for watching.